There we go. We've started the recording. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's special event and presentation. Judy Humphries is going to be talking about unraveling a 100-year-old mystery here, and this is in honor of Remembrance Day, which is tomorrow. Judy is the local archivist. She is the chair of the Gravenhurst Archives, which can be found here and is physically located in this building, which is the Gravenhurst Public Library. And I'm the CEO Chief Librarian of the Gravenhurst Library. And I'm going to be introducing Judy tonight. But before we get started, I would like to read our land acknowledgement statement. We acknowledge that the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis people were and are still the keepers and caretakers of the land and waters upon which the town of Gravenhurst now sits, which is covered by the Williams Treaty and the One Dish with One Spoon Treaty. We are deeply grateful for the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples who have shaped and strengthened this community for the benefit of future generations. And we are committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect. So you'll notice that everybody on all the participants, everybody's involved in the call or involved in the presentation there have been muted. And that's just because the focus will be on Judy's talk. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of Judy's presentation. And we do ask, if you have a question, to please send those in by chat. At the bottom of your screen, you'll notice there is a chat feature. And basically you type in the question that you have for Judy, and then she'll respond to those. Now, there is a possibility that Judy won't get to everybody's questions this evening. If that happens, then Judy certainly can take those questions. Either they can be sent to Judy directly, or they can be sent here to the library, and we'll make sure they get passed on to Judy. So we are recording tonight's event, as I mentioned earlier, and it will be available for viewing on the library's website in the next few days. Now on to my introduction of our very own local history expert, Judy Humphries. Judy was born in London, Ontario, but she grew up in various small towns before completing an English degree at Western and her teaching degree from Queen's. She came to Gravenhurst High School in 1973 to teach English, but left teaching in 1982 to raise her family. When they were old enough, her children, her babies, when they were old enough to be in school full-time, a fantastic opportunity as the librarian at the Ontario Fire College became available, and Judy took it. And that would lead to a 20-year career that came her way. And then the rest is history. Her third and present career, managing the Gravenhurst Archives as a volunteer, came with the retirement from her work life. The history of Gravenhurst is now a full-time, passionate commitment for Judy. And we certainly are pleased to have her with us this evening, as always. I'm very thankful for the great symbiotic relationship that the Archives has with the Gravenhurst Library. So welcome, Judy, and I'll hand the reins over to you.
Thanks very much, Julia, and thank you very much for all of you who have tuned in. I appreciate you being here, and I am looking forward to telling you about the soldiers of Gravenhurst, Morrison, Ryde, and Muskoka Township. So we're going to begin talking about that right now, and I am just going to okay, there we go. Uh-oh. Now I'm not moving. This is happening again, Megan. I've tried that, There we go. All right. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Great War and the men from Gravenhurst, West Gravenhurst, the former townships of Mortzen, Muskoka Township, and Ryde, who left their homes, their friends, and their families to serve and to die in the Great War. We're going to be talking about unraveling the identities of these men, who they were, which community they came from, and perhaps why they're not on our memorial, as most of them are not. How are we going to define our soldiers? Well, defining our soldiers is this. They're either born in Gravenhurst, West Gravenhurst, and these three townships, Morrison, Muskoka, and Ryde, which are now all part of the town of Gravenhurst, or they're men who had moved here to Gravenhurst, perhaps as children or as adults, to live and to work here. And they were living here at the time when the Great War began. I'm just going to get rid of some things there. How do we define killed in action? Because that's a term that not everyone understands. Killed in action really has several possible things to it. First of all, being killed in action literally means being killed during a battle. You can also be killed in action and die of wounds following an action. So in fact, there were many men who were very badly wounded. Some of them didn't die for as many as 5, 6, 7 years following the action. But unless they had died by March 31st of 1922, they would not be considered by Veterans Affairs Canada to be killed in action. Dying of disease contracted in war is also killed in action. But for any of these circumstances, the man who is being designated as killed in action must be recognized by Veterans Affairs Canada. I'm going to very, very quickly introduce you to the major combatants of this war, just to refresh your memory and set the scene. I want to be sure that everybody realizes that we're going to be primarily talking about activity that took place in Belgium and northern France. The combatants on the Allied side, our side, are in green on my screen and possibly, hopefully, on yours. Russia is over to the right, as you can see there. Also one of our allies. And you'll see that the combatants who were the enemy combatants, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and others who joined them later, are in a sort of a pinky orange color. All the blue colored countries are in fact countries that wanted to remain neutral. Belgium would have been blue at the moment when the war started, but since Belgium was invaded almost immediately, it's pretty hard to remain neutral when you've just been invaded by the enemy. So in fact, they were immediately a part of our Allied war effort. Another map is going to just focus you very quickly on the main central activity that I'm going to be talking about tonight, where most of our soldiers were killed. You'll see very clearly where the front line is, and you'll also see a little spot in the front line that bulges out in a very peculiar sort of fashion. And that peculiar little bulge is the Ypres salient. And let me show you what that looks like more carefully and closely here. What is a salient, for heaven's sakes? Well, when we talk about the Ypres salient, we're talking about an area where some of the forces, maybe divisions, battalions, whatever, have advanced more quickly than some of the others who are involved in the action. And they get ahead of the rest of the soldiers. As a result, they end up with a bulge in the front line. And as you can see, anybody who's in the front line of that bulge is surrounded on 3 sides by the enemy, in this case, by the German army. So the Ypres salient is that large bulge sticking out there. All the green things that you see on that screen are in fact forested or wooded areas. And there were many of them, and you're going to hear references to them tonight. The red areas are in fact cities and towns. So you can see, for example, the town of or city of Ypres, which is there. It's not called Ypres anymore, it's called Hubert, but in fact, Ypres is how we will always refer to it in Canada because we spent so much time in that neighborhood. I'm going to be talking to you about the battles that took place during this particular period, the Ypres salient first. And I am talking about the Great War here, and make sure that we are in the 1914 to 1918 time period, although really I'd like to extend that to 1914 to 1919, because in fact, soldiers of the Great War signed up for the duration of the war plus 6 months beyond the end of war. So in fact, many, if not most of the soldiers that had gone from Canada did not come home until the first 4 months of 1919. And if you're looking at documents from them, you'll see that and probably puzzle over why on earth didn't they get home in November of 1918? Well, no, they did not get a chance to do that until 1919. Here we're looking then at pictures of people wearing gas masks, and you'll very, very quickly learn why, in fact, these men would be wearing gas masks. I'd like to introduce you to what I'm going to refer to as one of my bookend soldiers. I learned something very interesting as I began to prepare my book on the 62 soldiers who were killed in action from our community. I discovered an intriguing situation that, in fact, of those 62 men, the very first man to die in action came from Ryde. The last man to die in action came from Ryde. And their names are Frank Carr, as you can see him here before me, and you will see at the end William John Cook, who also comes from Ryde. And I'm going to compare a little bit of their situation and how their experiences of war were different. But let's begin with Frank Carr. Frank Carr was born in Ryde. He moved with his family to Vancouver once things had kind of gone belly up here with the loss of the logging trade and so on. He worked as a postal clerk in Vancouver, but he's one of the very first men we had from Gravenhurst, from Ryde, to sign up for war. And what he did was he actually left Vancouver on the train on September the 1st, 1914, remembering that the war was only declared in Canada on August the 10th. So we're talking about 3 weeks basically into the war. No recruitment centers have been set up whatsoever at this point. But on September the 1st, he's on a train traveling across the breadth of Canada, heading for Valcartier in Quebec, which was the gathering point together of all the soldiers who were going to be sent over in the first contingent of Canadian soldiers for the Great War. So there he is. He's heading across the country. He gets to Valcartier. He signs up. He's actually attested by the 18th of September and has had his medical and so on. And he is one of 32,000 soldiers who left Canada on October the 4th, 1914, in a great flotilla of ships, perhaps the largest flotilla of ships ever to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And 32,000 Canadian soldiers were on them. And he was there. He was on that, in that first contingent. When he got to the battlefield, he would find himself engaged in battle. On April the 22nd, the battle began of Second Ypres, it was called. And in fact, in that battle, for the very first time in history, the Germans unleashed a gas attack. And he was part of the front line that received that gas attack. Over 2,000 men fell over the course of the 22nd to the 28th of April of 1915. He hung on with his unit, the 7th Battalion, for 4 days. They couldn't get relieved. It just wasn't set up properly for them to do so. Many men were deserting at the front line from the French army and some from other armies as well. And the Canadians held on. Frank Carr held on. Eventually he succumbed to the gas attack and the heavy, heavy bombardment that was going on of shelling from the German artillery. And he died. He was not found. His body was never found. He is in fact on the memorial, but he is not located on the memorial for Gravenhurst. We're going to have to talk about why. Another soldier I'd like to talk to you about is Archie McKechn, one of my favorites, I have to say, and you'll hear his name tomorrow when the names of the dead are read out. Archibald McKechn was born in Gravenhurst. He went to Gravenhurst High School, graduated there. He became a prospector. I think he was a bit of an adventurer, and he went up to Cobalt. And 4 motor machine gun batteries were looking for soldiers. And where did they go but to Northern Ontario? They went up there looking for prospectors and miners, people who had had perhaps a bit of a flair for adventure and for maybe were fearless, let's say. And they went looking up there to recruit soldiers, and they recruited Archie McKechn for the Borden motor machine gun battery, which is what you see in the middle of your screen. That is in fact a motor machine gun battery. It looks a little like a tank, but frighteningly less so than we would like to see. I think I would not want to have been in that. That's what they went into battle with. In actual fact, one of them was shelled, and it was blowing all over the place. Archie McKechn was one of 3 men who went out at night to try to gather up some of the pieces to see whether they could find anything usable. And while doing so, he was shot by a sniper in the ankle. It wasn't a hugely horrible wound, but he was taken to Calais eventually to be taken back to England. Hospitals had not been set up for the military to any great extent at this point. We're talking pretty early in the war. So he was going to be taken back to England on the hospital ship Anglia. Crossing the channel, they struck a mine. And the men who were on the top decks or who were somewhat mobile could get off the ship. The men who were in the lower decks, like Archie was, because he wasn't mobile, did not get out, and he drowned in a sinking Anglia ship. That's the picture shown to you on the right-hand side there, and of course is at the bottom of the English Channel. He was 23 years old when he died. The next soldier I'd like to introduce you to is Herbert White. Herb, as he was called, just a boy, really. He lied about his age when he signed up. He was 15 years old when he signed up. He was, in fact, taller than most of the men of his time. The average height for soldiers at this time was about 5'6". He was 5'10", and he went to Niagara Camp, which is like Niagara on the lake, to sign up so that the doctor that would examine him wouldn't know his story and wouldn't know how old he was. I'm not sure they'd have cared down there, but they certainly would have here. Anyway, he signed up at Niagara Camp and was in fact joined up to the 42nd Battalion of the Canadian Infantry. He was young in so many ways. The picture you see there of that dish and that little ornament, those were things that he went out and found while he was, while he had some spare time in England. He went out and found them and sent them home to his mother. He also sent home a Christmas card to his dad with hugs and kisses on it and so on. He was a boy, just a boy, but a man who was quite willing to go to war for his country. Unfortunately, his experience was a very, very short one. He was involved with the taking of Mount Sorel, and on the very first day of the battle, he simply disappeared in an artillery barrage and was never found. The next man I'd like to introduce you to is Herbert Thomas James Stamp. He went by the name TJ and was born in Gravenhurst, 1891. He was a man who worked in lumber mills. He went down to Longford and got a job there. He signed up to the 4th Battalion of the Canadian Mounted Rifles, and in fact was overseas in no time at all. The war diary for the day that he died starts off with, "It was a calm, beautiful, and noticeably quiet morning." That did not last, and in fact that day was lost in an intense bombardment by the enemy artillery. He too was never found. His name is inscribed on the Meningate Memorial, but he is not found on the Gravenhurst Memorial and should be. This is a sad story. This is the story of Jack Riemann, who was born in Severn Bridge. you can see that he's such a fun and pleasant looking fellow in that picture with his comrades. In actual fact, he was in a trench in the Ypres salient near Zilby, and he was part of the whole group of soldiers in the trench who had been told that they had to clean their rifles and get ready for action. And he was part of the 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles. So in fact, rifles were going to be important to him. He was turned talking to his fellow soldiers while cleaning his rifle, when from behind him, a comrade cleaning his rifle, and all of them, of course, had been completely unloaded, accidentally discharged his rifle, and it was discovered that there had in fact been a bullet in the chamber. The bullet struck Jack Riemann in the back of the head and killed him instantly. There was an investigation to make sure that negligence and perhaps even intention could be ruled out. And in fact, they were ruled out. It was strictly an accident. But what a horrible letter to come home to a family to say that he had been killed by friendly fire in the trench by his own comrade. There were other soldiers killed in the Ypres salient from our community. Percy Newell wasn't killed there. He was killed at the same time, however, this time period. He had moved from Severn Bridge, which is where he was born, out to Manitoba, and he had gone to Camp Hughes to sign up there. But he contracted pneumonia and died there the 20th of November, 1915, before ever getting to war. Clarence Lorne Adamson was born in Gravenhurst as well. He joined the 15th Battalion of the 48th Highlanders and was killed in action, was a very fine soldier, and received an award, a medal for his bravery. We're going to move on, and I'm going fairly quickly, I know, but we have a lot of men to talk about. The collection of battles known as the Somme is what we're going to look at next. And you can see how miserable and grim the Somme was, just looking at these two pictures, which are of the Somme. And the first man I'm going to talk about here is Alec Mortzen, who joined the 13th Battalion called the Royal Highlanders of Canada. He was a boy or a young man born in Gravenhurst, actually not all that young. And he was killed at Courcelette. His body was never found. He was in the trenches there and under artillery fire was killed. He's commemorated on the Vimy Memorial, but he is not on the memorial at Gravenhurst. This is a picture with his mum and his sister. Corporal John Alfred Marshall joined the 15th Battalion, or the 48th Highlanders as they would be called at home. He was born in London, England, but he immigrated to Gravenhurst and had become a mechanic here. He married a local girl. He signed up and joined the 15th Battalion, as I've mentioned, and was off to war. He too was in the Battle of the Somme, but the famous battle called the Regina Trench. And he died there again under heavy shelling, and is buried at the Courcelette British Cemetery. Regina Trench is very close to Courcelette. His name is inscribed on the Gravenhurst Memorial. Other soldiers that were killed in battles of the Somme, of whom I have no photograph. I'm amazed at how many photographs I've actually been able to find over the about 7 years that I've been involved in this project. But I have no photographs of these men. Would love to have them if I could ever find them. Evan St. Elmo Milliken, an interesting name, St. Elmo's Fire, as some of you will know, born in Severn Bridge, also joined the 15th Battalion, or the 48th Highlanders, and was also killed at this time, 26 September 1916, basically as part of this same Somme set of battles. Lance Sergeant John Sweeting Cuff came from England, actually, with his brother Arthur to Gravenhurst. John was a machinist. His brother Art actually worked for the train station, where he unloaded baggage and delivered it and so on, parcels and incoming goods to stores and whatnot. And Art received on the same day a letter or a notice telling him that his brother John had been wounded, and then about an hour later that his brother John was dead. He was killed as well at Courcelette, but he was found and was buried at Calais Southern Cemetery over there. And a third man who was also involved In the battles of the Somme, who came from Gravenhurst was Corporal John William McGuinness. He joined the 3rd Battalion and was killed at Neuville-St-Vaast, which is basically Vimy Ridge. This collection of battles for Vimy Ridge will contain a number of different skirmishes, we might call them, or battles. This is a very famous picture of soldiers going over the top at Vimy Ridge on April the 9th, 1917. And the first soldier that I'm going to introduce you to here is Corporal Alfred C. Myers. You've heard his name mentioned if you've been to Remembrance Day here. His name is always read out. He was one of 7 Myers boys who served in the Great War from Gravenhurst. I don't think another family from Gravenhurst made that much of a contribution. He actually was a teacher. He had moved out west to try to find work and so on. And he's shown on the left here with his brother Norman, one of those 7 boys. He had inscribed, he signed up to go to war, and was basically at Vimy Ridge. The soldiers who were waiting to go over the top were actually underground. They were not just in trenches, but they were actually right underground. In some parts of it, they were actually under the German military. And he inscribed his name on a rock underground while waiting to go over the top at Vimy Ridge. And you can see AC Myers, 128th Battalion, and Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, which is where he was teaching when he signed up. My son, who was down in the trench, he's a military historian, actually went and touched the spot where AC Myers had signed his name and realized that he was looking at a boy from Gravenhurst. He was never found because he had a very strange experience, we might say. He went into the trenches on a trench raiding expedition that used to happen all the time in war. He was heading through a German trench and heading through at night through the barbed wire with his other compatriots when he was shot. He wasn't badly wounded, so he sat down in this trench that he was in and said, "You guys go on and continue with your trench raid. Come back and get me on the way back and help me back to our lines." When they came back to get him, he was gone. He had been taken prisoner by the Germans, who were actually just down the trench and around a corner. And they had heard the whole exchange and knew that he was there. They took him prisoner and he died in their care. They let the Allied soldiers know that they had him and that he had died, and there was simply no hope of ever finding his remains. That was until 100 years later, when a group of men in Ontario went looking for the remains of some of the soldiers that we knew might be able to be found over there. And in actual fact, it turned out that he was buried with German soldiers. They were able to establish his identity. It took about 1.5 years to do so. There's a great deal of protocol has to be gone through before you can actually establish that this is truly who it is. But they were able to do it definitively and without question. And his remains were removed from that German burial spot, and he was buried with the rest of his own soldiers from his battalion over there. More of a happy story. The man that I'm introducing you to now is a man that we might consider one of our heroes. His name was Sergeant Frederick Arthur Smith, and he was born out by Morrison Lake on a farm out there. He received the Military Medal for Bravery, and it's very obvious to see why when we read about it. He had joined the 15th Battalion or the 48th Highlanders, and here he is in full Highlander kilt. It looks wonderful, every inch a soldier. He was tall, he was well educated, well spoken, intelligent. He was just one of those men that you would have really wanted to have as a sergeant in your unit. On the day that he was killed, here's what was written about the military medal that he won for bravery. During a raid on the enemy trenches in Cologne section on March the 2nd, 1917. This non-commissioned officer was in charge of a party on the left flank. Though wounded in the leg while crossing no man's land, he continued to lead his men into the enemy trench. The example set to his men, half of whom had never been over the parapet or over the top previously, had a far-reaching effect. In addition to this, he led a bombing attack on a German post, which was putting up stiff resistance, and carried on with his duties. Now he's wounded, remember, until fainting on being wounded for a second time. His devotion to duty is particularly deserving of merit. He was killed in action on the 3rd of March, 1917. And James Mckay also belonged to the 15th Battalion of the 48th Highlanders, and he too was killed in the battles leading up to Vimy Ridge. He was killed, it says in his circumstances of death register, whilst doing communication duty. Now, what that means is he was literally running himself personally, was running from post to post, bringing the messages of where people were supposed to be going, what was supposed to be going on, the timing that was going to take place, and so on. Unfortunately, he was perhaps a little taller than he should have been, and he was shot while going between advanced posts and died at Vimy Ridge. Hubert Corbet. Poor Hubert is a man that I think of as having had one of the worst war experiences of anyone I could ever imagine. He was born in Malta, Ontario, and if you're not sure where Malta is, I can tell you at the end of this, but it is very close by. He attested at Niagara Camp in 1915, as so many of our soldiers from here did. He reached England in October of 1915 and immediately, almost a month later, was hospitalized with influenza. Remember that this is starting to become the time when Spanish influenza was taking place. The pandemic isn't really a pandemic at this point, but certainly influenza has been unleashed. He rejoined his unit in February and was shot in the head on the 24th of June, 1916. He was actually taken to hospital and transferred to a Boulogne hospital where he eventually convalesced and then joined his unit again on the 5th of August. This man did not give up. He was shot in the right arm, shattering his radius. And in fact, they were trying to figure out how they were ever going to put it back together again or put his arm back together again, and decided to send him by hospital ship to the No. 2 Western, sorry about the spelling there, hospital in England. But he died of tetanus and on the 12th of April, 1917, a victim of, again, Vimy Ridge. William Harold Mulrow is another soldier I'd like you to meet, another one of my favorite young men. He actually does have to do with Mulrow Lake. In case you were wondering, his father was the first principal of Gravenhurst High School. And Mulrow Lake was renamed in honor of that first principal because of all of the work he did as a botanist. He eventually went on to become a principal at what would be the University of Guelph and died there. William Harold Mulrow had taken his family out west after his father died. He got a job as a teacher out there and signed up to go to war. He was the man who was in charge of carrying the Lewis gun, and I often think that that's what got him killed. He was killed while going over the top with his company in an attack on Vimy Ridge. He was shot and killed and died instantly. He was very, very young. Again, he was less than 20 years old when he died. Frank Waite is another name you're going to hear, as you will have heard. Certainly you'll have heard Harold Mulrow's name always read out on Remembrance Day. You do hear Frank Waite's name read as well. He actually was born in England. He was a Bernardo boy, as were his two brothers, and was sent here as a little boy. I have a picture of him as a little boy, actually, being sent to Canada because he was an orphan. He came to West Gravenhurst and got work here. He married here. He married a Barnes girl, Harriet Barnes, and unfortunately was killed in action before he could meet up with either of his other two brothers. He was hoping that he would meet his brother Sam, who had been a professional British soldier, and he was hoping that they might meet in warfare. I don't think that Frank realized just how enormous the Great War really was. And unfortunately, as he died, his third brother, William, was on his way to England to the war. He survived the war. And yet again, another man that I think you should meet is another man from Gravenhurst, Lance Sergeant Roy James Henley. He's one of these guys who, unfortunately, like so many of them, came off the ship, landing in England, and immediately was sent to isolation hospital, first with rubella, and then again. He was appointed a lance corporal, an acting corporal, a lance sergeant in really quick order. And I think that the meaning of that is not to take away from his skill or his abilities and so on, but really it shows you the sheer number of non-commissioned officers who were falling in the front lines in war. They had to be replaced immediately. You had to have officers there. And so every time someone fell in your unit, somebody moved up the chain. And he was moving very, very quickly. Practically every 2 months, he was being promoted to yet another level in the officer group of his group. He was killed at Chateau de la Haye in the battles around Arras. He was actually heading for a billet. He was heading to be in a sort of a safe spot, and was shot after coming off relief in the front lines. Charles Anthony McCauley is another Gravenhurst boy. He left here a little bit earlier. His father was looking for work, and Woodstock was a center for cabinet making. They made a lot of coffins there, but they also made a lot of furniture there. And his father was, I think, a highly skilled cabinet maker. So Charles Anthony moved with his family to Woodstock. He also got work in the furniture factories there. He was a part of the 1st Battalion on the 13th of April 1917, and would be involved in the war at Luce, which is a little town. He was killed in the trenches there and buried over there as well, near Lens. Thomas Gravestone is somewhat of an unusual soldier for us to have, because most of the soldiers that were killed in action from our community were not part of the 122nd Battalion that everyone talks about in Muskoka. The 122nd Battalion did not really begin to recruit until the beginning of 1916, and the war was well underway long before that. So many of our men had actually gone to war long before the 122nd was ever even thought of. Thomas Gravestone, on the other hand, went when he was old enough, because he was born in 1898. I mean, he's young at this point. He signed up with the 122nd, which was disbanded as soon as it got to England. There was no more 122nd. And from then on, all of the men of the 122nd were either posted to the Canadian Forestry Corps, which is what they had been told would happen, or a few of them who were fit were sent into battle. This man, Thomas Gravestone, who was in fact related to the Gravestones of Gravenhurst, that we know, the Russell Gravestone, who had Europe Plumbing and Electrical business and so on, was a relative of his. He was assigned to the Alencon district. He developed pneumonia, not a surprise, because of course so many of these men would be wet most of the time they were doing their work of working in planing mills and logging in forests and so on. In fact, though, one of the things that this does alert us to is the fact that the image of the fit and robust lumberjack is not in fact the reality. Most of the people who were in the Canadian Forestry Corps, or indeed in the whole Forestry Corps for the entire Allied side, were men who were either very short, or they were men who were not particularly fit. And so you will find that we do have another soldier who dies of pneumonia in the Canadian Forestry Corps. Albert Ernest Rennie joined the 18th Battalion. He was born in Severn Bridge. Actually, he was really born at Wasdale Falls, but Severn Bridge is close enough for us all to know. His family monument is at Cooper's Falls, and on the side of the monument, his name is listed there. he he was in the 18th Battalion, which was given the task of what I'm calling harassing the Huns. What was actually happening prior to Hill 70 was that they were attempting to keep the Germans from mounting units that were going to head to Passchendaele, where that battle was already beginning to heat up, or that whole long series of battles. They didn't want reinforcements going there. They wanted to keep the Germans where they were. So Hill 70 was really, the taking of Hill 70 was really mounted to keep the Germans in one spot and not have any more of them heading out to the east. And his job in his battalion was to go along harassing the Huns by dropping bombs and grenades and so on into various trenches and so on, going and doing as much damage as you could so that you kept them constantly on their toes and not thinking about heading anywhere else. And he was killed in the course of doing that job. He's actually related to somebody here in town, Doreen Forsyth. I think Doreen knows that very well. Harry Charles Burnett was another soldier born in Ryde. He, when he was a young man, moved to London, Ontario, and he worked in a hardware store there. He was actually lauded for his behavior in war. And I think it's important to know that some of our soldiers, in fact, most of our soldiers, did their duty with panache. In fact, he was sent a message by his commanding officer, and I don't think this happened very often, but it said, "My dear Burnett, I wish to thank you very much for the gallant and efficient manner in which you carried out your duties during the reign of terror on the enemy trenches on the morning of the 29th March. Your devotion to duty was most commendable, and I can assure you that such conduct is very much appreciated by me. Yours sincerely, Galt Macomb, Lieutenant Colonel." Don't think the Lieutenant Colonel had a lot of time for writing notes unless he was particularly determined to do so, and in this case he was. In fact, the circumstances of his death were recorded on his circumstances of death register. Whilst on duty in the trenches with his company on August the 5th, 1917, he was seriously wounded by enemy shrapnel, as it shows above, in the ankle and in the chest, which penetrated his chest. And he died the following day at number 7 Casualty Clearing Station. And you'll notice in the heading on his slide here, it says KIA for killed in action and DOW, died of wounds. Another name that you will hear read every Remembrance Day is that of Cyril Palmer. He was born in Muskoka Township, but in the part of it that is already a part of the town of Gravenhurst. He went to Gravenhurst High School. He was a GHS graduate. His father was a reeve in Muskoka Township. So he came from a family where some education and so on was important. He's another one of those soldiers who, upon arriving in England on the 5th of February, was immediately sent to isolation hospital with the measles. The sheer number of soldiers who contracted measles, mumps, chickenpox, and like on ships coming over to Europe is amazing. He was with the 16th Battalion in the field. He was shot and taken to hospital in England, but he died of his wounds while he was there. Harrison Vernon is a young man who was born in Gravenhurst in 1890. When he was old enough, he and his family headed out to Drinkwater, Saskatchewan, where they took up farming. Harrison had the unfortunate, well, perhaps he wouldn't have looked up on it that way. He joined up with a battalion that was very, very popular and was signing up men all over Saskatchewan, the 46th Battalion. Unfortunately, it developed the name the Suicide Battalion because they had a casualty rate in that battalion, death and injury, of 91.5% of their men over 27 months. That means every time they were in action of any kind. They were losing most of their men because they were in the heat of some of the worst possible battles. Hill 70 and the one that they particularly were in was particularly brutal. So they were constantly having to replace the soldiers who were being killed in their unit. And it remained as the suicide battalion to the end of the war. What I talked about when I spoke about Tweedtown a month ago is this man, Anton Sigfried Wilson. Anton was born in Gravenhurst, actually, to Olaf Wilson and his wife and into their family. He actually, as an adult, got a job with the CPR, working in Alberta as a bridge builder with the CPR. He joined up out there, the 175th Overseas Battalion. I guess he was in war long enough. He was there maybe about 8 months when he contracted tuberculosis. He was considered to have contracted tuberculosis during the war because he had his medical fitness test, no signs of TB at that time. So in fact, he is designated as killed in action, died of disease, DOD. He was sent, first of all, to Montreal, sent home to Canada for the treatment of tuberculosis, but it was a very advanced case. Once they knew that he came from Gravenhurst, they knew that they could send him home to Muskoka Free Hospital, and that's where he died. And he is buried actually in Torrance, in the cemetery there. Roy Urquhart was born in Gravenhurst as well in 1895. Roy went with his father and family, and they went up to a place just south of North Bay, and it was called Selwood Junction. Doesn't really, I don't think, exist anymore, maybe as a ghost town. Excuse my voice, I'm sorry about that. His father got work there, and so did he. He did sign up, though, however, to the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles. And he went home to visit his family before he left. And there's a photograph of them there. You can see him. He's sitting beside his father on one side, his sister on the other. I'm going to have to pause for a drink. The whole family had very clearly dressed up for his visit home. They wanted his last visit to be something he remembered well. Unfortunately, he never returned home and was killed at Passchendaele on the 26th of October, 1917. He's memorialized on the Menin Gate. He's one of the many soldiers I've spoken about. I haven't mentioned this all along, but he is not on our monument here. Another soldier that I've particularly enjoyed the story of is Jack Greenwood. Jack Greenwood was actually born in Mara Township, but he came to work on the Robinson farm near Kilworthy as a young farm laborer and became very good friends with the son of the owner. And in fact, I think was falling in love with the daughter, Bertie Robinson. We have the letters that Bertie sent to Jack. Bertie is a short form for Bridget, by the way. She sent letters to Jack. We don't have his letters back to her because I suspect she probably enjoyed them or destroyed them, sorry. We have all of her letters to him though, because they came back with all of his personal effects when he died. She was the one who he left everything to in his will. All soldiers signed a will before they went into battle. It was also Bertie who received the telegram, and this is an example. This is the actual, we have the original telegram that was sent to Bertie Robinson announcing the death of the man that she, I think, loved. And they always read like this: deeply regret, inform you, 853429, Private John Fred Greenwood, infantry, officially reported killed in action, November 16th, 1917, Director of Records. Could there be any colder way of telling someone that someone that they loved had just been killed in war? In actual fact, there was even a mistake in the telegram. He wasn't killed on the 16th, he was killed on the 6th of November, 1917. Almost a love affair, as I say. The letters of Bertie Robinson are quite interesting to read because she mentions the people who are starting to buy cars in Morrison Township. She mentions seeing an airplane for the first time and her thoughts about what it would be like to go up in an airplane. I've really enjoyed reading her letters. Here's a man's name that you hear on Remembrance Day each year, and that's the name of Walter Gladstone Perkins. Walter Gladstone Perkins lived on my street in Gravenhurst. He was born here. He was a GHS grad. He played the trumpet in the civic band, and even for a while in the band that was going to eventually be attached to the 122nd. But he chose not to sign up with the 122nd. He instead went to Niagara Camp, as so many of these men did, to sign up. I think they wanted to be away from the doctor, for example, who was going to examine them would have been Dr. McCauley here in town, and I think they wanted to be somewhere else in case he knew anything about them. The 76th Battalion is the one he joined up to in Niagara Camp. He was shot in the arm and the leg. He was transferred after that to the 1st Battalion, was appointed a Lance Corporal, but reverted back to being a private. I think he, like many other men, reverted back to being private because they did not want to be responsible to have to send men over the top or into the breach or over the barbed wire or whatever. He was killed during very intense enemy bombing. His body was never found. He is memorialized on the Menin Gate, but he's also memorialized here in Gravenhurst. And the picture on the left shows his sisters, Gladys and Pearl, with him before he went overseas. Other soldiers who were killed in action at this time in Passchendaele: Donald Ross, who was born in Gravenhurst, joined the Royal Grenadiers and was killed at Passchendaele. William Robert Wilson, another Gravenhurst boy, killed at Passchendaele. Passchendaele and Ypres. Passchendaele was very, very close as a community. It was a very small little community, very close to the city of Ypres. And so often the battles there were described as Passchendaele/Ypres. And James Alexander Frissell, who came from, Frissell, who came from Severn Bridge, was killed in action as well at Passchendaele. You can see that these men were killed within weeks of each other or even days of each other. These are men whose pictures I've never been able to find. I've written to hundreds of messages on Ancestry, attempting to find the relatives of these men to see whether or not all of these men had photographs that their families might have. In some cases, the families didn't even know they had a soldier in the Great War who had been killed there. The next man that I'd like to introduce you to is, in fact, an interesting one. He's Sgt George Taylor. He was born in Gravenhurst. He went to Gravenhurst High School and is a GHS grad. He worked as a printer on the Gravenhurst banner, which I think is sort of neat. But something else that's interesting about him is who his father was. His father was George Washington Taylor, an interesting name. He owned one of the first lumber mills on Muskoka Bay. He was the first reeve of Muskoka Township, or Gravenhurst, before it actually became a town. It was a village at the time. And he built the first wooden Albion Hotel, the one that burned down in 1887 in the Great Fire. Sergeant Taylor was killed while doing reconnaissance, as sergeants were so often asked to do, in a forward area. That means he was going out looking to see where the enemy was exactly, where they might have set up some machine gun nests and so on. And he was spotted and shot. Timothy Robert Allen is actually a Gravenhurst young man, even though, in fact, Bracebridge has attempted to make him one of their own. He was born here, but he did live in Bracebridge eventually. When his father died in 1906, he and his mother and the rest of the children all moved to Bracebridge. I think she had relatives there. He went to Toronto. He didn't enlist in the 122nd. He went to Toronto and enlisted in the Royal Canadian Dragoons, who were in fact a mounted or cavalry battalion. You can see a picture of them there. They're in camp, and they've got their horses, and they're blanketing their horses and unpacking their saddles and so on there. He was killed in one of those wooded areas that I showed you on an earlier map, and there were many of them. The enemy was trying to infiltrate the Bois de Genlis, and our soldiers were in the woods and were attempting not to let them in. His body was never found. He was memorialized on the Vimy Memorial, and in fact, he's also memorialized on the Bracebridge Memorial, but not here in Gravenhurst, where he was actually born. Sergeant Alfred Siddle Bowers is a young man who came from Severn Bridge. He was a farmer there. He joined a field artillery unit. I commend anyone who ever did that. I think that there were 100 different ways of being killed in the field artillery, not the least of which was from the actual sounds of the guns. The circumstances of his death are shown here. It says, and I want you to just hear what they're saying here about him. He was a sergeant. This non-commissioned officer's battery was being heavily shelled, and after having seen to the safety of his crew, he was proceeding to take cover himself when he was hit by an enemy shell and killed instantly. He's buried in France. Something most people will never have a chance to see is what a funeral would have looked like during a battle or during a war away from the front lines. Charles Emmanuel Williams was born in Gravenhurst in 1897, so he's a young man when he goes to war. He joined up with the Canadian Service Corps, Army Service Corps, and he was a driver, motor vehicle transport. What he probably drove would be those big transport trucks in which soldiers could ride. Now, this is an early day of motor vehicles, remember, 1916. So we're talking about, you know, very early trucks, but they did truck and bus soldiers to the front. So he was a driver. He, in fact, was not killed in actual action, but died of pneumonia, which he contracted in war. His funeral was held at Holy Trinity Anglican Church in Nice, in France. There's a photograph that we have of the actual funeral service taking place inside the church with his coffin and the soldiers from his battalion lining beside his coffin on both sides of it. This photograph shows him being carried from the church by his own comrades and followed by a line of his comrades from his battalion. And he's buried in Nice in France. Sgt James Alexander Thompson wasn't born here. He was actually born in Islington, Ontario, which is part of Toronto. He actually came here, though, to work because his parents were here. He worked as a clerk here. I'm not sure in what store or what business he was clerking, but in fact, he joined Lord Strathcona's Horse, another one of the mounted battalions. He contracted influenza in 1915 and had to be treated for that before he could actually go to battle. Eventually in 1917, he was shot in both the right hand and the right leg. And he had a compound fracture of the fibula area of his leg. The leg was so badly shattered that he had to undergo an amputation of the leg at the knee, but in fact died of his wounds. I believe probably they became septic, and he died in 17th of April, 1918. If we're looking at favorite soldiers of Judy's, this was one of the men who would rate fairly high on my list, just because of the letters that he wrote home that I've read. Milton Miller is sitting in the photograph on the left-hand side on the shore of Lake Muskoka. It's Muskoka Bay. And he's looking out over the lake, taking a last look because this is the day on which he will be shipping out. He joined the 3rd Light Trench Mortar Battery, not for the faint of heart. He's the son of Gavin Miller. For people who know the history of Gravenhurst 20 degree, the Gavin Miller farm is located where Muskoka Sands old golf course was. It's soon to become a development, I understand, housing development. But that old sands golf course was the Gavin Miller farm, right down to the lake, and they had cottages on the lake as well that they rented out. The family photograph that you can see that was taken there is a pretty stagey looking thing. Remember that when that was taken, which is well before this period in time when he's going to war, they had to sit very, very still for a very long time for the picture to take. And so, in fact, they're all sitting there trying desperately to hold their pose. That is, in fact, Hilton Miller standing in the background on the right-hand side. He was the oldest of the boys. Went off to war in this trench mortar battery. Because he was a corporal, he would be involved in some training. And so his little group, his little platoon was asked to fill 60 phosphorus bombs. Now, you don't even want to think about what that would have been like just for the sheer nerve of it, let alone for the sheer danger of it. And in fact, actual fact, while they were under his command filling those phosphorus bombs, one of the young men in the platoon dropped one. Gavin Miller was very badly injured. He was in fact burned, I think, quite badly. He was burned in the face, the neck, the left arm, the legs, and his left leg had to be amputated. The burn was so bad, but he died of septic osteomyelitis before he could be saved. So he was killed in action the 26th of June, 1918. George Edward Nash was born in Gravenhurst. He actually signed up to the Canadian Army Medical Corps as an orderly. His job would have been to attend the wounded who were being transported back to Canada because they were so badly wounded that they were not going to be able to simply recover and go right back into battle. These were men who were badly enough wounded that they were going to be shipped home to stay home in most cases. Now, it's not absolutely true because a number of men who were shipped home were actually brought back into war again. He was unfortunately on the Landovery Castle ship, hospital ship that was bringing the wounded home to Canada when it was torpedoed by the Germans, by a German submarine, and sunk. So he was buried at sea, 27th of June, 1918. We're now going to stop for a moment and take a look at the offensive that is termed the last 100 days. That period of time that goes from August the 8th to November the 11th, 1918, and involves a very, very heavy, hard push toward victory. It was determined that we just couldn't carry on with this phenomenal loss of life much longer, and we had to simply pour everything into a period of time where we could put the Germans on the run, and this is what that last 100 days was all about. The first man that I'd like you to meet here is William James Taylor. He was actually born in Ray in Muskoka Township. His family was a founding family out there. And if you wanted to think of his family farm, it was fairly close to where Muskoka Airport is now, because of course, Muskoka Airport is in the town of Gravenhurst. He was, in fact, another one of those young and daring men who would go off to be a miner at the Porcupine Mines in Timmins. There's now a place called South Porcupine, just outside of Timmins. He arrived in England in March of 1918. He transferred to the 19th Battalion while he was there. And in fact, he lasted only 10 days in the thick of battle before he was killed in action on the 16th of August, 1918. That was not uncommon for men to last such a short length of time. Now we come to Gordon McKechn. The story of Gordon McKechn is a very difficult one to tell because he had a very difficult war. He was born in Gravenhurst. He was born to Julia Ann King. She was the daughter of George King, who was a baker in the town. George King had a brother who was also a butcher in the town. They were a fairly prominent family. One of her sisters would marry Dugald Brown. One of her sisters also married a Mr. Port, George Port, and his son was Herb Port. So Herb Port and Gordon McKechn were first cousins. The war experience of Gordon McKechn was filled with missteps and punishments. He's the only soldier I've run across who actually experienced two trials by court during the war for misdeeds that he was involved in. His sister Margaret went on to marry Percy Frank Miller, and we know who came out of that union. Despite Gordon McKechn's very difficult time in war and a number of missteps that he had, he deserves our gratitude because he was in fact killed in action. We had asked him to go to war. He was killed at Chercy on the 28th of August, 1918, during the push for the last 100 days. William George Hedger was born in Severn Bridge. He's a guy who was transferred so many times to so many different battalions that by the time he actually got to France, he must have wondered exactly who he was supposed to be. This is another one of those situations where we can recognize how many men were being killed, how quickly, because each time, this is while he's in England now, remember, waiting to go into battle. He would receive a notice he'd been transferred to this battalion. Well, no, they need more men as replacements in this battalion, so he's going to be transferred over there. No, they need them over here. He was transferred 5 times before he got to France. He died of wounds, shrapnel wounds to the chest, penetrating his chest at number 42 Casualty Clearing Station. And he is buried in Aubigny Communal Cemetery in the northwest of Arras, which is an area that was heavily shelled at the time during the First World War. Roy Elwood Hawkins was born in Severn Bridge. Actually, he was born in Aurelia, but I suspect he was born in Aurelia because he was either visiting there or because there was a hospital there. In fact, his family was in Severn Bridge. He's a young man who was killed in action in October of 1918 in the last 100 days. And the circumstances of death, it describes his death in this way. He was killed during an attack in the vicinity of Blécourt. A comrade states he saw him in a shell hole and that an enemy shell dropped close, quite close to him, and no further details relative to the circumstances of his death are known, and they wouldn't be because, of course, he would never be found. I think they gathered together what they could, and he was buried at Sancourt British Cemetery near the Cambrai Road. Archie Allen MacDonald was born in Ryde. Despite articles in the Bracebridge Muskoka Herald at the time laying claim to this soldier, his birth certificate very clearly shows that Archie Allen MacDonald was in fact a Ryde Township boy. His father was a blacksmith there. When Archie was old enough, he headed off to Toronto to become a jeweler, and that's where he attested on the 20th of August, 1915. He joined the 4th Canadian Machine Gun Company and died of his wounds at number 20 General Hospital at Camire. He is buried in the Étape Military Cemetery in France. He does belong to us. He is not on our monument, as many of these men are not. Other soldiers from our community killed in action during this time period include William Watson Ridley, born in Gravenhurst, who died on the troop ship he was traveling in, trying to head to war. He contracted pneumonia on the troop ship and died and was buried at sea and never ever got to war. Corporal William Albert Richardson was born in Bath, but he moved here as a very young man. Actually, I think he was a young boy and came here to live in Gravenhurst. He joined the 122nd Battalion, worked for the Canadian Forestry Corps in the Gironde district, and died of pneumonia there. Robert James Lowshaw was born in Lewisham in Ryde Township. He too was a member of the Canadian Forestry Corps, but he didn't die in the Forestry Corps. He had the unfortunate experience, and this is going to be true of several men, of dying in a repatriation camp while awaiting being sent home. He contracted pneumonia in the camp. The conditions were dreadful in those camps, and he died on the 24th of October, 1918. And Sergeant Neil Stewart McCallum joined the Canadian Mounted Rifles. He was a boy born in Gravenhurst. He also died of pneumonia, but he was obviously not in the 122nd, not in the Forestry Corps. He was in the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles, as I've mentioned, and he died of pneumonia that he contracted in France in the war. You'll notice that he died about 10 days after the end of war had been declared. Of all the soldiers that I think of as my boys, Gordon McKinley Flowers, Sergeant Gordon McKinley Flowers is perhaps one of my favorites as well. Having been a high school teacher, I guess the fact that I taught a whole lot of young guys, all these 18 and 19-year-old boys, I have pictures in my mind of what they would have looked like as young boys in my classroom. And it's very, very easy for me then to feel a connection to them. He was a GHS graduate, a very smart young man, I think. He was a railroader in work here, and then quickly he signed up with the 122nd Battalion as soon as he turned 18. He was promoted to corporal and then to sergeant really quickly, even though he was so young. I think they could see leadership potential in him. You can see in the picture, I've got an arrow pointing to him. He's the second man in the train window on the left there. And his mother is on the immediate right. There's writing down her arm. That's on the original photograph. And it says it's Grandma Flowers. Well, that's his mom. And she's waving a handkerchief goodbye. They're heading out. And she would never realize that, of course, she will never see him again. Once the war was over and an armistice had been declared, Forestry Corps didn't get to go to England like every other soldier and wait to be sent home. The Forestry Corps spent months packing up the mills, selling off the wood, selling off the mills, cleaning up the sites. They had to get a letter from the mayor of the area saying that the site had been cleaned to his satisfaction before they could leave it and move on to the next area to clean. During the month of December 1918, a month after the war had ended, it rained for 27 days straight. And he was working, Gordon McKinley Flowers, in the rain, working on cleaning up a site, and being the sergeant, he would have a lot of responsibility. He contracted pneumonia and he died on the 7th of January, 1919. 4 days later, his unit was evacuated out of France to England to be sent home. Imagine the horror of his mother realizing he has gotten all the way through the war unscathed, and she's thinking, wow, he's going to be home soon, only to receive a telegram that he has died of pneumonia after the war was well over. Here's my other bookend. Sergeant William John Cook was born, it says, in Morrison Township. He was actually born in Ryde. I couldn't find the birth certificate to actually make that official in my own mind when I was making that slide. So I left it at Morrison Township. He said he was born in Gravenhurst, but that's not true. That was just an easy thing that lots of guys did. They would write down the name of the nearest community or town or whatever to where they had actually been born when they were writing their attestation papers. But he is a Ryde boy. He is the other bookend, as I've mentioned, along with Frank Carr, who began our whole discussion. William John Cook is one soldier that I admire tremendously for what he did and achieved and got through in his long period in the war. He, like Frank Carr, went immediately upon the declaration of war, and as soon as he knew about it, he went to Valcartier in Quebec to sign up. And he attested on the 23rd of September. That means he's already had his medical and everything. He's taken the train and gone all the way to Quebec. So he probably left just like Frank Carr did on the 1st of September to get there. He joined the 1st Canadian contingent as Frank Carr did, but he joined, John Cook joined the railroad troops who constructed and repaired and rebuilt infrastructure. What they were doing was constantly under the threat of shelling. They were being shelled constantly. The Germans were trying to blow up railroads, roads, everything every day. They were constantly building railroads to extend to the battlefields, to transport troops and material to the war effort. They had to rebuild them and rebuild them and rebuild them because they were shelled constantly. They were building bridges, they were building roads, they were filling in shell holes so that they could do so. It was an enormous task. He was in the war with the threat of shelling on an everyday basis from really, really early in 1915. He got there. Right through to the end of the war. He actually survived almost 5 years of war in battle, right in the middle of the thick of things. He was wounded twice, and then, wouldn't you know it, he is sent to a repatriation camp to be shipped home. The repatriation camps were so overcrowded and so disease-ridden, it's a wonder anyone survived. He didn't. He contracted influenza and then pneumonia, and he died in a repatriation camp after surviving 5 years in the thick of battle. Hard to believe, hard to justify, can't be, and he's buried in Sussex in England. His death is always one of those things that bothers me no end when I think about it. He is honored on the memorial here in Gravenhurst. So at least that's something. Other soldiers from our community who died in this time period: William Alfred McLean from Severn Bridge, who joined the Canadian Forestry Corps at 122nd and died of influenza, but not in the actual forest. He died in another repatriation camp called Kinmel Park. He died after contracting influenza from the overcrowded and horrendous conditions that he was living in. Kinmel Park actually experienced riots of soldiers, Canadian soldiers rioting because they were not being sent home. The war had ended. It was dragging on and on and on that they're in this camp, and people are dropping like flies with disease. Cecil Rivers Mills was born in Gravenhurst. He didn't die overseas. He died when he was at home in Victoria, British Columbia, but he died as a result of the wounds that he had suffered. I don't even know how to say that, but I'm going to say hemoptysis, and I don't know. It's to do with the fact that he was infected. His wounds were infected, and they reared again, and he died in Victoria, BC. Edward Carleton Martyr is not a direct descendant of the two famous martyrs of Gravenhurst, but a sort of an offshoot of the family. He was born in Gravenhurst. He died from the effects of poison gas attack at Passchendaele. He died in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. Unfortunately, he had just married. I don't know whether he believed that he would overcome the effects of poison gas or not, but he obviously was not able to do so. And he died on the 5th of March, 1922. George Henderson was born in England, but lived in Gravenhurst, had come here to work. He worked at Muskoka Sanatorium, a bit of an irony here. He joined the 122nd and was posted to the 53rd Company of the Canadian Forestry Corps. He died of tuberculosis, which he contracted in war. He was sent home to Canada, sent to the Muskoka Free Hospital for treatment of tuberculosis, and he died in the Free Hospital. He's buried in Lakeview Cemetery, and he died on the 22nd of March, 1922. If he had died much later than that, he would not be considered to be killed in action and would not be eligible for anything that resulted from that. So in actual fact, another 9 days and he would not have been in that group. In conclusion, I guess we need to talk about what really we're saying here, that 62 soldiers from Gravenhurst, West Gravenhurst, Morrison, Muskoka, and Ryde died as a result of their service in the Great War. This was a service that we asked them to undertake. We asked them and then eventually compelled them, although none of these men were compelled, but compelled them through conscription to render service in the Great War. Of these 62 soldiers, 44 soldiers who were killed in action are not on our monument. There are 26 names on our monument, but there are some issues. 4 soldiers are listed on our monument in error. They had nothing whatsoever to do with Gravenhurst, other than that they were sent here to our hospitals, our sanatoriums for the treatment of lung disease. They were not added until 1970. I have no idea why they were added to the second iteration of the memorial, but somebody walking through the cemetery must have seen their names and said, oh, these guys should be on the memorial. I wouldn't have them taken off. We honor them here. Their bodies probably couldn't be sent home because they couldn't either find their relatives or the family hadn't enough money to bring them home. Another soldier who is listed on the monument did not die in the Great War. In fact, he never even got to the Great War. He signed up, but was judged to be unfit. So why he's there, I don't know. He too was added in 1970. Another soldier is listed incorrectly. He's not John Walmsley, is what it says on the monument, who did not die in war, but he's actually John Walmsley Foy, who did die in the war. These men who went to war and died for their country because we asked them to deserve better than this. I'm going to conclude by showing you these numbers while I ask if there are any questions. I know we're probably way over time at this point. No questions are posed. You'll see there that our population dropped tremendously after the loss of the lumbering and logging industry here. So that between 1901 and 1911, we lost almost 25% of our population, and another 9% the following census in 1921. But those are the populations that I'm showing you there for the war. And we sent an awful lot of soldiers. We sent over 500 soldiers to the Great War and lost far too many. Thank you very much for being with me tonight. I appreciate it very much. I hope that if you have a chance to do so, you will attend the Remembrance Day services at Gravenhurst. We are holding them. Other communities are not, but we are holding them, and I believe that we are holding them in our usual fashion at the Gravenhurst Legion. I've not missed one in a long time and don't intend to miss tomorrow's either. So thank you very much for being with me.
Thank you on behalf of everybody who is attending this presentation, Judy. That was a very sobering talk on the young men, and so many young men from Gravenhurst who lost their lives during the Great War. Really appreciate your willingness to do the research on it, and your fascination with it, and your ability to share such in-depth stories of all of these people with us. It's very moving. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I think we have one comment. It wasn't a question, but I'll just read it out to you. Thank you so much again for a fascinating talk. In 2017, we visited Vimy Bridge and attended the Remembrance Day service. Like the magnificent monument at Vimy itself, the service did not speak to the glory of war, but to the need to bear witness to those whose lives were cut short in sacrifice, and to grieve with those who loved them. Thank you for creating this opportunity to bear witness to the lives of these local soldiers. And
I appreciate that. That's a wonderful comment, because it's not a matter of glorifying war. It's a matter of remembering, because we forget at our peril. Those who forget or do not remember their history are doomed to repeat it. And we see far too much evidence of that in the world, even now.
Absolutely, for certain. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Judy, and thank you. And everybody stay tuned for future local history talks with Judy, set to take place in the winter and spring of 2022. And I believe those are going to be done virtually as well to start off the year anyway.
Yes.
And we'll make sure we'll make sure we get the message out about the topics for those talks. And yeah, thank you, Judy, and thank you, Megan, as well for your
Yes,
time.
thank you, Megan, and thank you, Public Library, generally speaking. It's a wonderful partnership that we have between Gravenhurst Archives and Gravenhurst Public Library. I'm very thankful for it. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.